Good afternoon. Добрый день. We are doing this event today in English, and I hope that's okay with everybody who is attending. My name is Andrei Markov. I'm an associate professor of this department and advisor to the dean. I've been working for 20 years at the World Bank, doing operational projects in social sector and coordinating donors. After leaving the World Bank, I returned to Russia, and I'm working right now on issues of development aid. I'm teaching a course on how development aid works. I'm passionate about this, and the reason for this passion is that while working at the World Bank, I was traveling. I was traveling to Africa, I was traveling to Kyrgyz, I was traveling to Russian regions, and I realized that while we have huge prosperity in some parts of this country, in some parts of prosperity in the world, conspicuous and unacceptable consumption or hyper-consumption in some of these places. I saw horrible suffering, misery, and I realized that we at the university need to bring this dilemma of inequality, dilemma of poverty versus this affluency, to the thinking of you, students or professors. I'm not calling that we need to take away from the rich and give to the poor. Absolutely not. But we need to think what should be the policies and thinking and support that the poor of this world will need. I'm very excited and very happy that the Russian government is aware of this problem, and some of you know from our course, some of you may not know yet, that every year the Russian government is allocating $1 to $1.2 billion for development aid programs, primarily happening in the countries like Kyrgyz, Tajikistan, some debt reduction to Cuba or Vietnam. All of these are very poor countries. So there is quite a bit of movement in this area from our Russian side. Unfortunately, very few people know about it. Unfortunately, there is no information available. Unfortunately, the experts are not debating. There is no public discourse about this. But I took a decision recently to allocate a bit of my personal effort and commitment to trigger that debate, to trigger that discussion. And I think that university, between different colleges, not only economic colleges, and looking here at Mr. Bartenev, who is the Associate Dean of the College of Global Processes, that we could build a partnership to move these things forward, because also Mr. Bartenev is the editor-in-chief of the first and only course of development aid in this country. So we are not starting from scratch. We are moving forward. And it's important that the Ministry of Finance is concerned with this question. So the Ministry of Finance gave a certain amount of money to a very good friend of mine, Mr. Tigran Schmiss, who is representing here the World Bank Moscow office. And Tigran is managing a program which is working on building capacity, of building Russian experts' knowledge in development aid. So that means that we have Mr. Bartenev, we have Tigran, so we have allies. And as part of this partnership work, and also because Peter Harrold triggered quite a bit of interest in our courses, we invited that we would maybe invite Peter to come and Ministry of Finance in Tehran said yes. So Peter Harrold, professor of George Washington University and former operations director of the World Bank, a person who's worked in Ghana, Sri Lanka, 7 years on China economic reform as chief economist for China. He's here for several days. He worked with the Ministry of Finance, an intensive training course with the foundation, and today he's with us here at Moscow State University. And the floor is yours, Peter. This is recorded. This will be then converted with some translation, and we will make it available for various experts or future experts of development aid and future students. So Peter, please. There will be Peter's presentation and then questions and answers, comments, maybe some handshakes. So please. Why didn't you applaud me?
Okay, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to be with some of the students that I've had video conferences with of the machines that sometimes work and sometimes don't work the last couple of years. So, when this thing comes,
yes,
I am going to be talking to you about what is happening in international economic development, or perhaps more accurately, we should perhaps say what is happening in international economic development cooperation. Oh, I can move it, can I? I see. Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, so I've called it why, what, how, and who, and you'll see why as we move along. So I'm going to touch on 4 themes, 4 topics. Particularly, why should governments give aid, or why should people be encouraging their governments to give aid or to give development? You will just say one word on terminology. We've always used the word aid. We tend to use the word development cooperation nowadays as you might say it's more politically correct way of saying it. Aid has a connotation of paternalism about it still. It's a very common word, so we'll still use these interchangeably. I'm trying slowly to get rid of the word aid in my discourses and only use development cooperation, because I do think it's more appropriate. But there we are. We'll still be using it somewhat today. So why governments give aid? Why do they participate in development cooperation? And we'll touch on some recent approaches and initiatives. We'll look at the new players, and of course you cannot talk about what is happening in this area without discussing China and China's actually long-standing role, but a role which has accelerated very much in recent years. And then, because you probably know that I live half of the year in Washington, D.C. still. So rather than wait for you to ask me about President Trump, I will address the question of U.S. policy under President Trump, because if I don't answer it in advance, I'm going to have to answer it later, so I might as well start. Okay, so why do governments give aid or participate in development cooperation? And why should you be encouraging your government to do so? Really, it's about poverty, and it's about solidarity. There are 28 countries, 28 countries with a per capita income, that is income per person, of less than $1,000 a year, less than 68,000 rubles a year per person. Make that into a daily amount, and it is a very small amount. It is significant that all but 4 of those 28 countries are in Africa. So the 24 out of the 28 poorest countries in the world are in Africa. And 1 is in your region, Tajikistan. The core reason why governments and why the taxpayers of those countries give money is the solidarity with the situation of those countries. The belief that the rich countries, the better off countries of this world have a moral obligation to help the poorest countries of the world. The European Union is a very clear example of this. The largest item in the budget of the European Union is for regional economic development. This is the transfer on grant terms, not on loans, on grants, of literally billions of euro every year from the richest part of the European Union, Germany, France, UK, Luxembourg, etc., to the poorest parts of the European Union, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, etc., in an attempt to bring up, and very explicitly stated, the objective is to bring the income of the poorest members of the European Union up to the same income as the richest parts of the European Union. To bring the poorest regions of the richer countries up to, like the poorest parts of Ireland, for example, or of Portugal or Spain, to bring them up closer to the average income. It's a moral, social obligation of the society to try to bring up its poorest citizens to the same level. That is not the philosophy in the United States or in quite a lot of other countries, but it's very important that it is driven by a moral obligation within those countries. So now we're going to look at the 4 historic reasons why governments gave money and get to these are, as it were, in historical order. This modern concept of assistance from governments to other countries is really rather recent in the history of relations between countries. It really only started in the post-war period. The Marshall Plan that you probably know about, where the United States financed reconstruction in post-war Europe, was in effect the first aid program. There were transfers within from colonial powers to their colonies, but we don't necessarily deal with those. So then there were really 4 types of aid that began with a diplomatic push behind them. Say, started by the US, which came up with this first. The end of colonialism and the post-colonial period. Colonialism began to end just 3 years after the end of the Second World War, with the independence of the the large South Asian countries slowly moved to Africa. And the colonial powers came to understand that if they wanted to continue to have strong relations with those countries and historical influence with those countries, they would need to continue support in the post-colonial period. The Soviet Union, the USSR, began its aid program in 1953, and that was 75% of the assistance was going to socialist countries and the balance to friends. The three biggest recipients being India, Syria, and Egypt. Who can tell me what's the biggest aid project that the Soviet Union ever financed in the world? Anybody know? Anybody?
Cuba.
Huh?
Cuba.
No, not Cuba. Okay, it's the Aswan High Dam in Egypt.
We had a report on Aswan.
Okay, that was the biggest ever project financed by the Soviet Union, a project that was turned down by the World Bank, and has been a steady supplier of water and power to that country ever since. Okay, OPEC countries began to support countries. Why? Because they wanted to use aid to generate support for the Palestinian cause. And then finally, and still today, China used aid to persuade countries to recognize the People's Republic of China as the one and only government to recognize China. In the early post-war years, well, earlier, until 1972, I think it was, it was Taiwan that represented China in the United Nations, believe it or not. I wonder whose idea that was. And China wanted that to change, and so if you wanted to have aid money from China, you had to cancel any diplomatic relations with Taiwan and recognize the one China policy. So the diplomatic function was strong at the beginning of the process. Then many countries began to recognize the humanitarian calling, and this remains about right. I noticed I put the word check in there, and I did check it. It varies from year to year, but it's often 25 to 30% of total aid, total development cooperation, if you want to recall it that, transfers from rich to poor countries, is from humanitarian aid, that is to relieve suffering. This is, of course, I suppose, most graphically in the case of response to natural disasters. I was the director of the World Bank office in Sri Lanka at the time that the country was hit by the Asian tsunami, which is one of the very heavily publicized natural disasters of our time, and the world was extremely generous towards the people of East and South Asia who suffered from that natural disaster. There are man-made disasters to which we respond. You may have read about the dam in the Lao People's Republic that collapsed recently. So a man-made disaster. And the disasters that have flowed in certain countries like Ethiopia, which where drought confounded, terrible agricultural policy, which was already causing hunger. There's pure poverty relief. A shortage of food is not always or even usually caused by disaster. Shortage of food, the inability of people to be able to get enough to eat, is most often quite simply caused by poverty. And so there are humanitarian programs, of the most obvious being the World Food Program, which operates in many countries that are not subject to either natural or man-made disaster, but simply have large parts of their countries where the people are so poor that they do not have enough food to eat. And that's sort of the purest of the type of poverty relief. And now, the single most important generator of humanitarian relief is conflict relief. Most importantly, in terms of money, it's of course support to the refugees who are the refugees, both international refugees. It's a technical issue, but it's important. A refugee is somebody who leaves one country and enters another as a consequence of a conflict. They are equal in number by what are called internally displaced persons, that is, people who have had to leave their homes within their own country as a consequence of a conflict. If you think of somewhere like the Congo in Africa, which has been having a conflict for a very long time, literally millions of people are internally displaced within the country. So conflict relief is a very important generator now, probably accounting for about 20% of all financial flows as we see. The third has always been commercial motives. It seems to be receding, but it's not gone. And what are those? What do we mean by commercial motive? This is when the governments gave money, gave aid or cooperation in order to further their own commercial interests. Okay, so how did that physically work? First, the most important was what was called tied aid. This is when a country gives money to somewhere, to another country, and says, we can have this money, but you can only spend it in my country. You can only use it on goods and services that we will supply. Chinese assistance today remains fully tied to procurement, to expenditures on Chinese goods and services. Why is that a problem? Why is that a problem? The problem is that means that the country is not getting the best value for money. They may be paying 20, 40, 50% more to purchase the goods and services in the supplying country than they would if they purchased those goods internationally. And this means that the development cooperation is not going as far as it ought to do. So it was a very bad way to use the money. A much worse way, an even worse way of using the money was what export subsidies and what was sometimes called aid for trade. And I knew, because I in the early parts of my career, when I worked for the British Development Ministry, which wasn't as good then as it is now, there was a program, a pot of money, and if a company was trying to get a contract, and if it was turning out that this British company was 20% more expensive than the other company, they could come to the development ministry and say, we need a grant of 25% to subsidize this export, and then we can get the contract. A terrible, terrible use of aid, and happily one that was made, well, not technically speaking illegal, but the OECD countries decided that that was a practice that they all should stop. They probably still do it quietly, but not out loud. The third was, the third commercial motive was in countries where the companies would find the project, and then having found the project, they would get their money, their governments to give the aid to finance the project. So when I first worked in Africa for a government, we would have visitors from Japan, and they would look around and they'd say, well, we could do that project for you. I remember a power supply project. We needed new generators in that country. And they said, yeah, we can supply those for you. I said, yes, but how are we going to finance them? Well, we'll get Japanese aid. I did worked in a couple of instances. It wasn't too bad, but it wasn't too bad from the country's perspective. But it was interesting that you had the dialogue not with the government about whether the government wanted to support your project. The dialogue was with the commercial entity that was interested in selling their products to the country. And then finally, we have the supposedly, there's certainly enough coincidence to think it exists, that countries are supported which have the ability to provide raw materials to the country that is offering the aid. This was earlier the case with Japan, and now it is certainly a widespread belief that this is the case in China, that China gives assistance to, well, let's take two country examples, Sudan and Angola, where they provided money and they provided aid, and then they provide commercial loans as well. And the commercial loans are repaid in the form of oil. And there's a long-term commitment to supply oil to China to repay the loans that have been received. So that is the fourth of the commercial motives still there. These are still things that stain, if you like that word, that still harm the practices of development cooperation, but I hope they are slowly disappearing. The fourth, and what is now universally the single most important motive, and you might find it odd that this is number 4, but it's number 4 in terms of time. But it is now overwhelmingly the most important motive, which is to support development, the desire to see the poorest countries of the world be able to eliminate poverty, to slowly reduce poverty over time. Why did this become the most important motive? The first is one that is very relevant to to Russia, two big factors within the world went away. You're all too young to remember, but we are not in the 1960s, we believed there was a huge danger of global conflict, of nuclear conflict. Your government built spaces where people could shelter in the event of nuclear war, as did the United States. And in that situation, you're not thinking about poverty. You're thinking about, well, how can I use aid to have people, allies on my side? And then we had the Cold War, which is a significant influence. You know what I mean by the Cold War, the diplomatic war, I suppose, that we still have, but between then, the capitalist world and the communist world for conquering the minds of people, and a lot of aid was used to have people to become friends of the capitalist world or friends of the communist world, and the Cold War went away. So two big factors. We stopped fearing that we were about to enter global conflict. We stopped having this active debate about communism versus capitalism at that time. So those things went away. You know, the other thing is that was really, really important, and that is the growth of the information era, the fact that we know about these things. In 1980, and it turned the corner in a major way long before your time. In 1984 saw one of the worst famines that we have ever seen in Africa. It was in Ethiopia, and it was on television. It was on television. Now, I'm not being superficial when I said it was on TV, and that mattered. The same was true just a few years ago when I was in Sri Lanka, and I don't know if any of you saw any of this, but the tsunami itself, the actual events of the tsunami, of this massive waves coming in to countries and carrying away people and cars and houses, this was on television because people were there with their phones, people were there with video recorders, and they all went on TV, and everybody saw it, and everybody gave huge amounts of money to try to compensate for it. The Ethiopia famine was on TV and caught the imagination of popular music artists in Britain and in America, who then arranged global concerts to raise money for this famine. And you may think that sounds trivial, but the extent to which that changed the consciousness of the people of the world about the situation of the poorest people was absolutely vital in changing consciousness about poverty in Africa. So since then, people have known much more, and now, of course, we know about these things and we can see them instantly. The third factor that we had, I understand you don't have in Russia, but I wish you did. We had this throughout many Western countries, the growing influence of non-governmental organizations, of civil society movements, who started life as charities, we used to call them. They started life raising money to help people suffering from famine, suffering from poverty throughout the world. And they then started to say, well, wait a minute, we're collecting a bit of money and we're making a bit of difference, but really our governments should be doing more about this. And they started an activist movement to get their governments more committed to development cooperation. Oxfam is one of the, you've probably heard the name Oxfam, one of the single biggest NGOs in the world. And they forced the British government to adopt the UN target of having 0.7% of GNP in development cooperation. And that movement, that development of an activist, non-governmental movement interested in, and only interested in, that factor of raising government's contribution to addressing world poverty was hugely, hugely important in Western countries. And then finally, this emerging consensus within Europe of the moral obligation, the thing that we started, that we see with Europe's own institutions. This absolutely universal belief, particularly within Europe, of the moral obligation of the rich to help the poor, which reflects, it's probably weakening a little bit now, but it reflects the general political flavor of Europe for much of the last 4 decades, which has been left of center, social democratic, high taxation, high distribution of income within the country, very significant welfare programs within the state, and therefore the belief that, well, if it's our obligation to help the poor of our own country, it's also, and perhaps even more, our obligation to help the poor in the rest of the world. So that has become accepted as the core obligation. Okay, so we're all committed to development, but what does that mean? And as I'm sure you either are already learning in your courses, or as you will certainly learn as you proceed in your courses, there has been no unified single theory about that we all subscribe to. How is it you go from poverty to middle income to comfortable income status? There was never a single answer. Fashions have changed over time. We used to believe, and of course Russia's own, or Soviet Union's own experience in transforming itself from an agricultural society into an industrial society was significant in world thinking about this. 50s and 60s were dominated by thinking that you get out of poverty by investing in infrastructure and in productive investments. There was a sort of counter-reaction to that in the 1970s. Oh no, actually it's about basic human needs. It's about making sure people have education and health and housing. Then along came the 80s and 90s, and there was a switch from, if you like, leftist thinking to rightist thinking, the era of quote, structural adjustment, the belief that the only thing, because at its heart, this is what people were saying in that era, all that's important is policy. You get the policy right, and everything else will fall into place. You don't, and this is quite literally, many people said this, governments do not have to invest in infrastructure, because if you get the policy environment right, the private sector will provide all of the infrastructure that you need. Turned out to be nonsense, of course, because there was never any proof that that was going to be the case, and the proof, and it simply turned out not to be the case. And we know too that in richer countries, in Russia, in France, In Germany, the state invests enormously in infrastructure. So, but that was structural adjustment, policies, everything. We have had much more of a consensus. We had these big swings from, if you had left thinking to right thinking, to leftist thinking to rightist thinking. And now we have more of a consensus about the sort of things that we need. We need a lot of investment in human capital. We need that to take place within a sound policy framework. We need it to be significantly community-led. And we need to build institutions that can carry out the necessary activities. With that, we do see, and with the growing availability of many sources of financing, the financial institutions are shifting from a pure, or seeing their primary role as a source of financing, to seeing their role of continuing the financing source and accompanying that with knowledge transfer, knowledge and guidance and support in how to address problems, how to build the institutions that we need in the current framework. There are three things in the development cooperation framework that have gone on. And by that development cooperation framework, I mean in terms of global arrangements that have emerged, or global events that have emerged, that have changed the picture and changed the way we think about things. The first, and it was in a sense to my surprise, but it was certainly true, the first thing that came along that was new and was just a dramatic change was the development of the Millennium Development Goals. I see I've misspelled development, but the Millennium Development Goals. I'm sure you know what the MDGs were. They were first adopted in the year 2000. They went to the year 2015. In the year 2015, the successor set of global targets called the Sustainable Development Goals, because they now included things like the environment, were adopted. This was for the first time an international agreement on what were the core elements of addressing poverty that we all needed to get behind. And I don't know if the MDGs are something you study in the course especially.
We didn't agree originally that if anybody would be allowed to intervene or ask a question, but maybe we could agree now, and I propose that because your message about MDG differs somewhat from the message that I was giving to the students, to the whole row that is here, okay? Because when I was talking about MDGs, yes, it was important, but it's a kind of something that was agreed in New York. The international experts, the heads of the states, yes, they agreed to sign off, but I was saying that the real ownership for development sitting with the country bureaucrats or task team leaders in the World Bank, that did not necessarily coincide with the big global framework. We were a bit more kind of, and I remember even I quoted the article in The Economist, very negative about the proposal of SDGs, which was published early in 2015. And actually, I need to tell that Peter shared with me the draft slide, so I made some comments, and he accepted, but this one was missing. I didn't. You start talking about new ideas with this global UN-based frame. And my kind of real question, not provocative question, is to what degree this global consensus would really influence and make a difference in country level work and dialogue.
Okay, I can assure because
again,
I was living and working in Africa.
Okay.
Then, and every country that I knew in Africa took the MDGs, took them very seriously, presented, translated the global targets into country-level targets. And those country-level targets were then used in cooperation with the international community to augment financing by almost 50%, much of that increase going to Africa, in order to support the country's plan for the achievement of the MDGs. So I saw on the ground huge commitment that you. I'm not going to get into it. We can take the rest.
No, it's not kind of in debate. But as you move, okay, go ahead and lay effectiveness, because I see that there is no mechanism for enforcing MDGs, right?
No.
And there is some similarity with, for instance, Paris Declaration.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It must mostly be.
But Paris Declaration is not fully implemented, and MDGs, you are saying, is really moving forward.
Well, what I'm saying was that the MDGs were very significant because they were the first time that we all got behind these things, and in a simple way, and that appealed to many ordinary people. Should we reduce? Is it a good idea to try in the next 15 years to reduce child mortality by 50%? It's sort of a dumb question, but that's what it said. And that, everyone said, well, that's a good idea, I'll give money for that. And if my government is going to put money, I thought they were giving money to corrupt dictators. But if they're giving money to reduce child mortality, I like that. If they'll bring down maternal mortality by 50%, I like that. If they will double access to safe drinking water. But you see, it translates this fuzzy idea of let's do something about poverty. It translated it into something concrete that people could say, yes, that's a great idea, let's do it, let's do it. And that's why I think it was important. All right. Then we had this movement that was more or less at the same time. You could almost say it was a response. I think it was in particular a response to the emergence of new donors like China. But really what it was this. Okay, we've got the MDGs, we're going to use the MDGs to increase aid by 50%, and they did that. It went from 100 billion a year to 150 billion a year in a couple of years, in a few years. So, big change in the volume of aid. And they thought, uh-oh, we're actually going to have to make sure that this works, that aid is effective, that it actually brings about results. And so they started an aid effectiveness agenda. They began it by themselves, that is the donors talking to each other. They slowly, by the time they started in nice places like Rome was the first meeting, and Paris was the second meeting. And then they thought, oh, well, maybe this doesn't look so good. So then they went to Ghana, Accra Agenda for Action, and then finally they went to Busan in South Korea for the fourth. And each time there was a slow shift from it just being an OECD country club to having truer partnership. it had lots of good, it had and has still, this is still going on. What's important about it is that they were talking about how can we reform the nature of the partnership between the rich countries and the poor countries and change it from a relationship that my friends in China would call paternalistic and hegemonistic. And if any of you know socialist jargon from history, you would know that hegemonism is a very, very bad thing to be accused of. And to move it to a much more genuine partnership where countries are in charge, where instead of competing donors work together, where this commercial motives for aid start to disappear, etc. There was a number of items. This has not yet had any significant effect. It remains a huge disappointment, but it was and remains an important institutional move to try to be better citizens when it comes to the world of development cooperation. And the third factor that has become increasingly important is the rise of new donors. The most obvious, the most discussed is the rise of China. There are other new donors as well, South Korea, Russia, although Russia has always had an aid program, it's just now it's becoming more like a Western aid program, if you like. And Turkey, the United Arab Emirates are a big donor, Saudi Arabia, etc. So there are new donors, and they're very important. So this is about development cooperation. I wanted to give you 4 numbers that I hope will go into your head, because you must never forget these 4 numbers. They're very, very important, okay? We often talk about private charity, private foundations. As you see, about 20 billion, we don't really know, but about $20 billion a year flowing to poor countries through these sorts of foundations. Official aid has jumped. It's now $150 billion a year. But look at these other 2 numbers. Private capital flows to the same countries, to the poor, to the group of countries that receive development cooperation, around 400 billion a year, and that's in a low year. It's been as high as 600 billion. So 3 to 4 times as much in private capital flows. And then the single biggest flow, and something that we almost never talk about in development courses for some reason, I don't know why, because it's the single biggest flow. The problem is, what do you say about it, I suppose, but workers' remittances, workers who leave their country and they go somewhere else, usually on their own. This is men or women who go on their own, they work in another country, and they send money home. This money performs the same function, so far as the country is concerned, as does aid or other forms of internal flows. It flows from outside back to the country that are then spent in the country for productive and for consumption reasons. And that's the single biggest source of money flowing to poor countries. And isn't it surprising that almost no country in the world has a policy on worker migration and how to support it, how to manage it, how to make sure there's no exploitation, especially how to make sure there's no exploitation of women, how to make sure money flows back smoothly and at low cost to families back in the home country, etc. It's a very interesting that there are, of course, there are exceptions. Some countries have it, most do not, and it's hugely important. All right, so this is why we give aid. In terms of money, in terms of the actual total amount of money, who do you think is the most generous country when it comes to giving aid? United States. And that's because it's the biggest, right? So after the United States, who would you guess? Germany. Good. Next. After that, only got one more. United Kingdom. Well, you are very good. You must have told them all this before.
No, because I forgot your name. This lady is about to finish her PhD on development aid of Germany.
Okay. Here's the top 10 DAC countries, but nobody else makes it the top 10 anyway. Here's the top 10 countries in the last, well, not in the last 3 years, in 2014 to 2016. It's more or less what you'd expect in terms of the dollar amounts of aid, or very similar to, except in the case of the UK, United Kingdom, where I come from, which, because of the strength of the NGO movement, gives proportion. So it's bumped up into the 3rd place. It's by no means the 3rd richest country in the European, in the DAC. Okay, so that's the amount. When you look at it that way, you can look at it graphically as well, except of course you can't possibly see a graph, but when you get these, you'll see the graph. Okay. So, America is the biggest economy in the world, and so it gives money, and so of course almost inevitably the United States gives more than any other country. Is it the most generous as a share of its income, do you think? No. Who do you think are the more generous countries as a percentage of their income? Any candidates come to mind? Norway, Sweden, very good. Any others? Any other countries that are that are a bit similar to Norway and Sweden, you might? Denmark, Netherlands. Okay, very good. Okay, so in that I kept you guessing for long enough. Very good. So this is the share. This is, if you like, a generosity index. This is the share of development cooperation as a percentage of GNP within DAC countries, there you are, Sweden, Luxembourg, this is weird. Luxembourg, we should never pay any attention to any statistic about Luxembourg, okay? It's bizarre. It's by far the richest country in the world according to the statistics, but it's just weird. But so ignore Luxembourg. So Sweden, Norway, Denmark, United Kingdom, Germany, Netherlands, etc. And poor little United States, and you can just about find it almost all the way over to the right, which gives a lot of cash, but it's a very small amount of the income in the United States. Do you think if we looked at other countries, can you think of any countries outside of this DAC donors who might give an even higher percentage of their income as aid? And I've already mentioned them. Okay. No, not China. No. China's even less than the United States as a share of income. Turkey and the United Arab Emirates both give more than 1% of their GDP in aid. In the 1980s, Saudi Arabia used to be the highest as a percentage of GNP. You may.
And Russia is 0.1%. So $1 billion of Russia is 0.1%. So Russia didn't make this kind of top group, but it is not negligible.
No.
It's close.
Because you have to be in debt to make this actual list.
Ah, that's a political decision.
Okay. So, who receives the most aid nowadays? Afghanistan. Syria. You people are good. Any more cases? Syria, Afghanistan. Any more? Why did they get so much aid? Syria, Afghanistan get so much. Why? Because of conflict countries. Any non-conflict countries you might think about? Israel, yes, well you're right. They don't actually make this list because the definition of aid, because most of it's not actually aid. It's on the aid budget, but it doesn't meet the DAC criteria. Okay, we'll have a look at it. I do think it's interesting. It relates to the humanitarian issues we were talking about before. Syria has become, Syria and Afghanistan, by some distance, considering these are, population-wise, these are small countries, but they receive a lot of support because of conflict and, let's be honest, because the conflict is one thing, but the fact is that the refugees created by the conflicts in Syria and in Afghanistan have begun to have impact on the aid-giving countries through the refugee crisis, and so the countries react by giving money to try to address this. For example, by giving huge amounts of money to Turkey and to Jordan to prevent refugees from leaving the region. You then have countries like Ethiopia and Vietnam. Turkey is an oddity because Turkey gets all this money to house Syrian refugees. India still. Egypt continues to get massive amounts of money from the United States. Jordan, for this, because like Turkey and Lebanon, it houses huge numbers of Syrian refugees. And Tanzania, because Tanzania is every donor's favorite country in Africa, to be honest. It's also quite big, but it's their favorite development example. Okay, the MDGs are there for you to, if you look at the slides later on. We mentioned the aid effectiveness debate. I wanted to put those in a more practical context. Here are the four big issues that are facing the donors as they think about their development cooperation in the present time. The first is a pet theme of mine. We live in an area of a results focus. We're giving all of this money, say the taxpayers. We want to know what you're getting. We want to know how many children are living instead of dying. We want to know how many children are in school instead of not being in school. We want to know what's happening to the rates of communicable diseases in countries. We want to know how many people have access to safe water. So we want to know those results. At the same time, there is a consensus that the only way to make the difference in these areas over time is to build the institutions in those countries that deal with it. We can't address the problem we can't solve the problem of education in Ethiopia. Only Ethiopia can solve its education problem. What we do with our support is to help to build the institutions that provide education within that country. institution building, and I'm happy to say, by the way, that from my conversations, it really does appear that your government, one of the things your government thinks that it can do most usefully is to help to build the institutions in poorer countries, in areas where it has, where Russia believes it has something to contribute, like education, immunization, and food security. So capacity building is a big theme of Russian aid. But if you're going to build institutions, you must be patient. You must be willing to be a partner over 10 or 20 or 30 years, because you don't build institutions overnight. The second big challenge is this. The average size of a development project, of a particular contribution of a donor to a project in a developing country, the average size is $2 million. The average size 30 years ago was $2 million. There's 3 times as much money as there was 30 years ago. The number of projects, of development projects that exist in the world has multiplied. There are literally thousands of projects ongoing in any country at the same time. Aid is what we call fragmented. Every donor wants to have their own little project in every area in every country. And it's not the way public expenditure works. Public expenditure doesn't work by dividing it into thousands and thousands of small components. Public expenditure has expenditure programs. And it's a very, very big problem for development administration and for countries in trying to have productive public expenditure and productive investments. The third is letting go. And this is harking back to the reasonable criticisms that there's a lot of paternalism and a lot of deterministic behavior in donors. There should be no such thing as a donor project. There should be financing for development, yes. But donors shouldn't say, we have these projects. The country has the project, and we help to finance the project. But no, we say that's our project. We even say that the language that people use is often very interesting because it says something about attitude. When there's a project, the donor says, I'll give this much. And the government then puts its share in. Donors call that counterpart financing. Counterpart financing. The donor has the project and the government is contributing to the donor's project.
It should be the other way around.
It should be the other way around. It should be the other way around. It's and think about education. Think about in any country in the world that you like. Think about how much a government spends, and think about how much the donors spend. In any country in the world, the country is financing 80 or 90%. Even in a poor country, the government is paying 80 or 90% of the cost of education, and the donors are topping that up. And yet, we talk about projects the wrong way around. Ownership, the lack of ownership in projects is the single largest explanatory factor for why development projects fail. They fail because it's the donor's idea and the government doesn't care about the project because it wasn't their idea in the first place. Changing that is hugely important. And the final thing is that we have a very complicated system. For various reasons, we have a lot of complications in the way this takes place, and the bureaucracy of development is a big, big problem. All right, I better accelerate and turn to China.
Yes.
China few things. Everyone says it's very big, it's becoming the biggest donor in Africa. Everyone says it supports corrupt people, corrupt dictators. Even Russia, Russia accuses China of supporting corrupt dictators, right? I've seen your president making
that's fake news.
The third thing they say is that it's all about supporting the Chinese industry and Chinese labor because that's how projects are carried out by them. And they say China only gives aid in order to obtain raw materials, oil and minerals for the future. Those are the 4 accusations that people made about Chinese aid in Africa. And they say it with a lot of certainty and with a lot of vitriol. Is vitriol a word people know? They say with a lot of anger.
Emotion.
An emotion, an accusation. So China is accused of these things. So what do I think is the truth? It's very hard to say what the truth is, of course. What is reality? Aid from China, that is something that is grant-like. Your government, when it gives aid, basically gives grants. Most donors nowadays, when it comes to the poor countries, they give grants. Chinese aid is actually rather small. It seems to be about 1/20th of the size of what the DAC donors are making available to the poorest countries. One big difference, they focus on roads, and the Western donors focus on human development. They give a lot of money to countries that have corrupt leaders, but the way Chinese support works, it's very hard for the leaders to get hold of that. It's much easier for a corrupt leader to get hold of World Bank money than it is to get hold of Chinese money. Because China never lets go of the money. You don't actually get money from China. You get goods and services, and you get projects. You want a road? We'll build you a road. We're not going to give you any money for you to build a road. We'll build you a road. So the Chinese company...
And with Chinese labor.
Chinese labor,
Chinese equipment.
Chinese construction companies, Chinese engineers. There are, of course, local costs involved, so we'll import Chinese goods to sell in the local market, to generate local money to pay the labor while they're living in the country. So actually, the existence of the loans might help corrupt leaders to hang on, but it doesn't, like has been the case with some World Bank money, it doesn't actually permit the corrupt leader to take money out of the loan and put it into their own Swiss bank account or wherever they keep them. There's no clear link. There's absolutely no clear link between aid and raw materials. China gives aid to about 51 countries, most of which don't have any raw materials anyway. They'll give aid to any country that is poor and refuses to recognize Taiwan. They give lots of commercial loans, however, and they make lots of commercial investments into countries that supply raw materials. And as I mentioned earlier, the repayment for those loans is often defined in raw materials, in oil in particular, but in minerals such as one example is Zimbabwe, where cadmium, which is I have no idea what cadmium is used for. Maybe somebody scientific knows what cadmium is used for. But the loans to Zimbabwe, to the country of the corrupt dictator Robert Mugabe before he was removed from power earlier this year, was through minerals. And they have no conditions The other big thing, though, that is true, they have no conditions on governance, no conditions on policy in general, except for the one-China policy. They've been sponsors of the so-called new multilateralism. They're bigger members of the World Bank group now. They give more money to the World Bank and they have a higher share. There are two new multilateral development banks that China has sponsored and hosts. One of which, the New Development Bank, you are a founder member. The word for this is the BRICS Bank. You know what the BRICS are, right? Yes? Everyone knows what the BRICS are. Good. This is the BRICS Bank. If you look at what they're actually doing, almost all of their initial operations are co-financing with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, interestingly, as they build up their own capacity, I suppose. A friend of mine, who actually used to work for me, he helped write the operations rules and the environmental safeguards there. One of the banks is headed operationally by a former World Bank director, and the other by a former Asian Development Bank vice president, both Chinese, in that case. So they are doing things. Some thoughts on China. It's a mixture of genuine support and commercial interests. I'm going to upset Andre again now, because one of the, I told the students before, one of the interesting facts, you can travel on a road from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in the northeast of Africa, from Addis Ababa to Johannesburg in South Africa. You can travel on roads built by China. And developing country politicians love roads. They do these, you see, these turnkey operations are a blessing and a curse as far as countries are concerned. It's very complicated to work with something like the World Bank. All sorts of rules and steps you have to go through. China says, you want a road? Here's a road. You want a water supply system? Here's a water supply system. They'll hand over, they'll do all of the work to provide the infrastructure without conditions, because that's their philosophy. That was their philosophy in the development of China. That's their philosophy for how to help countries. Countries have what we call a capital endowment deficit. They don't have the wonderful infrastructure that we have in countries like Russia. And you may not think it's wonderful, but it's dramatically wonderful compared to most poor countries. So that's what they provide. One of the things that gives them a good reputation, Chinese experts live like local. When Chinese experts are managing a project, they live the way local people live. When Western countries have foreigners working in a country, they live extremely well. They live in the best part of, like I did when I was a World Bank official in poor countries. You live in the best part of town in a nice big house, and you employ people to cook for you and clean your house. The Chinese live in the villages on relatively low incomes. They get income back home, but not income in the country. And people like that. They're really not helping human capacity very much, because they're not teaching the country very well how to build roads or how to build schools. They're delivering them, but they're not helping people. They're not building capacity, they're building infrastructure. They're accused of being a rogue, so-called rogue donor. I don't think they're a rogue donor, but they are not yet a member of the international community. But here's the single most important thing about China. They are lending lending, not giving grants. The grants are perfect. They are lending billions of dollars to Africa on not hard commercial terms, but this is not aid. This is full repayment over a modest period of time with an interest rate that is lower than commercial banks, but a lot higher than countries can afford. And Africa, many of you may know from studying development earlier times, Africa had a terrible debt crisis in an earlier period, in the 1990s, early 2000s. The Western donors decided they had to address this, and they dealt with it, and much of Africa's debt was eliminated in the late 90s and early 2000s. Africa's debt is back up where it was, and within the next year or two, it's going to be 2 or 3 times what it was 20 years ago when we had the first debt crisis. But here's the difference. The debt crisis in the 90s that was solved was debt from the DAC countries. So there was a moral obligation to solve it. The World Bank forgave debt to countries for the first time in its history. Do you think the West, do you think Russia is going to say, oh, yes, let's bail out countries because they've got too much Chinese debt? I don't think so. So this is going to be China's problem. China is creating, not intentionally, because this is not an intent, it's just not part of the calculation. China is creating a debt problem in Africa, and China will have to solve that debt problem when it comes to it. I am going to skip this issue of private foundations. It's not yet very important, but watch out for this, watch this space, because there's a movement in America that's very interesting. The American government doesn't seem to care about world poverty much anymore, but the billionaires, you know what a billionaire is? Somebody
Yes.
who has $1,000 million. The billionaires do, it's pretty easy if you're a billionaire. So billionaires, hundreds of billionaires have promised to give half of their wealth to address world poverty. Bill Gates, the head of Microsoft, you all use Microsoft software, he has already given away 80% of his wealth. And Warren Buffett, who is the single largest, richest individual in America, is an investor, doesn't produce anything, he invests. He has given away about $80 billion, put it into the Gates Foundation, and he has told his children, so this man is worth about $90 billion, and he's told his children they'll get a couple of million each. Well, for most of us, a couple of $1 million is pretty good. For them, though, they're getting a fraction of 1% of his wealth when he passes away. But these are the private foundations. I would guess in 20 years' time, private aid in America is going to exceed official aid. Okay. I've given you for the future the eight principles of Chinese aid because they're quite interesting. And so let me just almost conclude with our last topic. What's going on? What's going on in America? What's it going to be? Okay. President Trump is an anti-multilateralist. He doesn't like multi-country agreements. He doesn't like trade arrangements with big blocks of countries like the European Union. And he certainly doesn't like multilateral institutions. He doesn't like the UN. This has been manifested most vividly last week when he cut United States support to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the agency which looks after 5 million Palestinian refugees, and he has cut the money from that. He'd like to cut aid by 20 to 30%, and proposed that last year. Congress said, no, aid is an important tool for cooperation for our diplomatic relations. They didn't say there's a lot of poor people in the world, but they said it's important for our relations. So they refused to cut it last year. That was his first year. Mr. Trump would like to use aid as a political tool. It's a very old-fashioned approach to aid, and only for friends. He made a public threat. Anyone that says nasty things about us in the United Nations will cut off. Unfortunately, he doesn't actually run the aid program directly, so it didn't happen. But that's just significant to get the attitude. And that was part of the justification for when he cut aid to Palestine, was that the Palestinians continued to say nasty things about him. Congress still wants an aid program. We'll see who wins, and the midterm election, the elections coming up in November are going to be very important. I think this can't be good in the short term. There's going to be negative consequences in the short term. I believe that the US will return to its core values in the future. I said post-Trump. Post-Trump. I believe the US will return to its core values, but I don't think it's going to be very good in the short term. Okay, so Andre said, give me three, give the audience 3 takeaways, 3 conclusions. So 3 conclusions for you. Poverty is still this huge, huge challenge. 28 countries where people have less than about $100 a month to live on, 6,000 rubles a month to live on. It's an honorable thing to do to participate in the international movement to try to address poverty, and those of you that are studying this topic, I hope you will consider taking this up as a future way of life. I have zero doubt that in the next 30 to 50 years, Russia will be an enormously important participant in this international effort to reduce poverty in the world. I have no doubt about that. It might not be tomorrow, it might not be 5 years, but within this coming period, within the period of your careers, this is going to be an important part of Russia's contribution to addressing the world's problems. The two biggest economies in the world are generating 2 big issues, and that's something to watch very carefully, because it seems to be about one thing perhaps, and it's actually, its consequences are very difficult for the poor. The US is withdrawing from the world economy. The US is trying to focus all of its attention on itself and less on the world. And at the same time that that's happening, the second biggest economy in the world, China, is building this huge mound of debt in Africa. These are 2 fundamentally important challenges for the world that I want you to watch and think about from the lens when you start reading these stories. Think, oh yes, because if that happens, this is what happens to the poor. If the income of all of these countries starts to be consumed with repaying debt, what happens to the poor? If the US ceases to contribute to UN organizations as a political gesture, what happens to the poor? That's the lens I want you to have. And the third is that in the Western countries, we've responded very well in terms of resource, pretty well in terms of resource transfer. We've increased the resource transfer. We've been relatively generous in terms of upping our efforts, in terms of financing, and we've been really bad about changing the way that we do that in terms of increasing the effectiveness of that money for the long-term good of the poor. That's the next step. And the next generation of people involved in international development cooperation are going to have changing the system of resource transfer as one of the biggest items on their agenda, and that's a pretty good thing to be involved in as well in the future. So those, I think, are the three big things I want to leave with you to take away. And hoping that we still have, I don't know if we have any more time. Let's see if I Peter,
thanks a million. We have been actually working for an hour and 10 minutes. There was a kind of moment in the middle when you guys were a bit more actively involved. But the class is an hour and 20, 25 minutes. So I think that we do have 10 to 15 minutes in principle for possible questions. And Peter, just for you to know that the audience is a mixed one. Some people have been part of our class last year. There are kind of students of the master's program that just joined the program and under Sofia Borisovna Karlovskaya, who is the head of this program. We have some people from the faculty of global processes, right? Oh gosh, this is very important not to make a mistake, okay? And they will explain. We also do have some people who are working in a small group of a team working on promoting Russian education expertise in the developing countries, and that is called CSED. That's part of one of the initiatives of capacity building of Russian Ministry of Finance that you mentioned. So we have different type of people in the audience. So basically, how many questions do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, let's ask the questions. Let's put them together, right?
Yeah, sure.
We ask them. If we have other questions, then we will have a second round. Okay, Mana, please. We do have. We don't know.
I have a question that is connected with the ownership shape that you mentioned. What do you think should be the shape of ownership in new countries? Because I don't agree with you that the shape of ownership should be opposite than it is now. Is, for example, the World Bank and the Monetary Fund, they, for example, come to a poor country in Africa and they try to help them. Why shouldn't they give some requirements and require some results from these countries, and why should these countries control these 8 programs? I don't think it would be effective if they will take the total ownership of these programs and projects.
Yes.
The question.
There was some other questions here, and then this one.
So, you've told a lot about foundations and states, because their interests, they not always coincide with each other. States have commercial interests, political interests, and what about private foundations? Are they, for example, satisfied with the work of state organizations or not? As I know, because I'm interested in German development politics, German NGO, they always criticize state politics. They don't like it in general. Thank you.
Yes.
I have more of a comment. Probably if you allow me to do it after all the round of questions, I will.
Okay.
In the economic expert group. First of all, thank you for an interesting presentation. And second, especially interesting was the slide with the 4 figures. But as I understand, you can't really compare them in terms of financing for development, right? Because remittances are often spent on consumption, and FDIs, for example, are often directed to resource extracting companies in the developing countries. In the research works, I often see references to FDI or even remittances as an alternative to ODA. So what do you think? Is there really a real alternative to ODA in terms of financing for development? Thank you.
Okay, good. Are there any questions here?
Just a second.
Okay, please. Okay, Peter, what did
Start?
Answer.
Okay.
Let's do the second round then.
Okay. What should be the shape of ownership? And if we hand over control of all this money, is it going to happen? Here's the problem, really. Let me answer in terms of a practical example. Okay, so I lived in Ghana for 5 years. Now, in the northern part of Ghana is very dry, but has underground water supplies. Very little rain, but it has underground water supplies, no rivers. So water supply comes from wells. So for many years, the aid agencies said, let's give them water supply projects. So they would go around and they would dig the wells for the countries, put the pumps on the well, and say to the community, there's a pump for you, for your water. Go away. And they would start to use it, and then after a little while, perhaps it would run dry, or it would break. And they said, okay, well, this is the well that belongs to the Canadian aid program, so we'll wait for them to come and fix it. Or it belongs to the government, so we'll wait for the government to come and fix it. And you could drive around, and there were hundreds of wells all over the north of Ghana that were no longer being used because the community didn't own them. They didn't feel that this was theirs, and they didn't think it was their job to look after it. So then we started to do this a different way, and we said, okay, we are happy to come and provide support to construct wells, but you have to contribute. You have to, these are going to be your wells, so you have to pay for some of it. You're very poor, so not so much, but you should start saving. And then when you've got this much, we'll give you the rest. We want you to nominate 2 people who are going to be trained in how to maintain the well. And we'll train them for you. And so this program started, and I went back 3 years later, and they were very proud to show me how their pump was still working. And the woman who was the mechanic, and very proud of it, in fact she called herself a mechanic. She said, I'm not a man, I'm a woman, so I'm a mechanic, not a mechanic. And she showed me how she keeps the well working the whole time. Because it was theirs, not some strange gift from outside. Now this is a small example, but it's the same principle for the aid project. Africa has many hospitals that don't work because some donors said, we'll build you a little hospital. And then they build it, and here's your hospital. Oh, but we haven't got any staff. And we haven't got any money to pay the electricity bill. And we haven't got any money for supplies. So the hospital is never commissioned. Governments have to own the program, or it won't work beyond the life of the project. It's not there in the project. Now, I agree that the capacity isn't always there to do everything. And okay, so we have to account for that. But it's my belief, and it's my observation from spending all of those years in countries, that if we don't change the balance, if we don't start saying, we're going to help fund your program, tell us what your priorities are, we will never have sustainable change. And change that can last long after the donor has gone away. So that's my belief. If we're trying to do too much, if we're trying to do more than their capacity can sustain, then you have 2 choices. You have to either not do, be a bit more patient, but also then focus on building that capacity instead of artificially trying to change it in the short term. That's my belief. I also believe this. We treat countries a bit like children. We say, no, we can't trust you. We can't leave you by yourself because we don't trust you. We have to watch over you and make sure you're not going to do any harm. We're going to make sure that you don't steal the sweets from the sweet jar or the biscuits from the biscuit jar when we're not looking. We don't trust you. So we're going to keep the key to the biscuit jar, and we're going to watch over everything you do. And if you treat people like children, they behave like children. So I believe instead you have to treat people like adults. And how do we treat adults? We say to adults, here's the rules of the game. Here's the rules of society. Here are the laws by which we live as a society. And if you break the laws, here's the punishments for breaking the laws. And I believe in the world of development cooperation, that's how we should be much more. We should treat our partners like partners and like respected clients. But let them know that if they steal the money, instead of spending it on the people, there are consequences. And those consequences will be imposed. So it's that philosophy. Okay. I actually think that in the United States, there will be growing competition between the private foundations and the government. the private foundations have been focused on different things than the government. They have focused on health issues to a very significant degree, focused on trying to increase immunization, focused on trying to fund research into a vaccine against HIV/AIDS, funding the growth of tertiary education institutions in developing countries. They're doing different things, and they're doing it in a very direct way. And one of the things that I'm not entirely sure about, but I think is good, they're not afraid of saying, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to find a cure, a vaccine for HIV/AIDS, we have to fund research in the most developed countries. We're doing that because of the benefit down the road for developing countries, but for now, we're going to spend the money in Switzerland, because that's where the advanced medical research is going to take place. And they're not afraid of saying, I'm spending money that's going to, that is for the long-term development. And Bill Gates, as a person, and Melinda Gates as a woman, are not afraid of standing up and talking more than almost anybody else in the United States about these issues, and they're putting their money behind, as we say in English, they're putting their money where their mouth is. They're talking about these issues, and they're trying to do something about these issues. People know more about development issues by hearing it from Bill Gates, I think, than they do from hearing it, certainly from hearing it from the government or the World Bank. As that money grows and grows, I think it is good. There is going to be competition, and hopefully then what will happen is a growing dialogue, and the nature of U.S. assistance may get better. The issue of the issue of foreign direct investment in businesses. It's important to think about those things as big things. The fact is, however, that when you look at the distribution of foreign direct investment, it's heavily skewed towards the countries that are already doing okay. The biggest, well, actually, believe it or not, the United States is the biggest recipient of foreign direct investment in terms of globally. But in terms of developing countries, China is by far the biggest recipient of foreign direct investment. They don't need assistance in that sense. And more generally, when you look down, where is foreign direct investment going? It's going to more developed places. There is not very much foreign direct investment in Africa. And it's financing it's financing the development of the private sector, and that's a good thing. It's generating future income, but we need a lot of other things to go with that as well. Similarly, remittances are relatively heavily concentrated as well. It's a bit unfair, but it is people from countries who have a very good command of English who tend to be the most employable. Bangladesh is the single biggest supplier of international labor. Little Sri Lanka, where I used to work, has a population of 20 million, 1 million people, about 90% women. work outside the country and send money back all the time. Philippines has one of the highest percentages of total foreign income. So again, remittances are by no means well divided. If you look at the share of remittances in Africa, it's dramatically smaller than it is, say, in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka or in the Philippines, the three biggest per capita recipients of remittances. So long as poverty is with us, and that's going to be a long time, I do not believe that FDI and remittances are an alternative. I believe they ought to be complementary. There are different things that need financing. Foreign investment is not going to do too much to expand primary education or tertiary education in other countries. But ODA can help that. But ODA can't generate the new industry that is going to come along. In Ghana, foreign investment came along and realized that Ghana was technically a perfect location for call centers because of the number of, I'm sure all your colleagues over here will know the technical term. It's one of the number of bounces it takes off. How many satellites something has to bounce before it goes to where it's needed. And so data processing and call centers became a big, especially data processing became a big theme in that country. I used to submit my medical claims to the World Bank, and they came back to Ghana to be processed, and then sent back and bounced back again. And you never finance something like that through ODA, through FDI. And as I say, remittances remains one of the great areas where its impact could be improved through better policy. So these, I believe, can be complementary activities. But will they replace ODA? Not in your lifetime.
Peter and colleagues, there has been an exchange by email between Vladimir Bartenev and myself, because he requested for a couple of minutes of comments. Okay, and I suggested, well, maybe you come here to do that. And on the way, I repeat my introduction of Vladimir because there has been a program of putting together the group of Russian professors and the Russian professors from different universities traveled to University of Sussex, and then they put together this lecture course. And Vladimir has been the person who was editor of that publication. It's available online also. And right now, he's about to finish his doctoral dissertation. It's not a PhD, it's kind of a doctor of science. But how do you want to...
I was not expecting for you...
No, you
here, but...
You take the mic and you go ahead.
Come.
First of all, nice to meet you, and thank you for such a structured lecture about the basics and sometimes very intricacies of development. But Professor Markov started saying that he is passionate about development. I would start that I'm passionate as well, but I'm sometimes very skeptical and pessimistic about what is going on, much more probably than you as a practitioner. And me, myself as an academic, probably I'm allowed to provide some level of skepticism. And if you let me comment on several things that I was taking notes on your slides that actually was surprising. When you were talking about humanitarian aid, you said that it's less politicized. And everyone in the audience will agree that it is like that. But in theory, yes, but not in practice. And what is going on right now, and we are following in places like Syria and the Middle East, we can see that humanitarian aid is the most politicized what we're witnessing right now. And if countries cannot agree on, even if they give money to places and zones liberated by Assad forces or not, it's not that they are not care about humanity, it's they care about if they support Assad's government or not. And this is one thing. Another thing, you said that development really got development motivation, became a mainstream in the development assistance. And you also had a line, global conflict went away. And probably if we were in the 90s, I was a small child then, but still, I would agree. But when I already got into the university and the last 2 decades, what we are witnessing in the development assistance, it's not depoliticizing of aid, it's repoliticizing and securitizing of aid. And the very fact that you mentioned that actually MDGs provided the 50% jump in aid, yes, but it coincided with 9/11. And the big boost in security and political aid to places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and all the other countries on the forefront of terror, which has nothing to do with development at all. And I hadn't seen any paper that actually could prove that the large amount of this increase was development. It's arguable, I think, if we get back to early 2000s. What we're seeing today, and again, I'm talking about the fragile regions, that the World Bank as well is thinking that this is the biggest challenge in the implementation of SDGs. Basically, what we're seeing right now is that there are so many political actors, Iran, for example, Iran, Turkey, China, Saudi Arabia competing with one another, Russia as well, in places on the earth. And again, the intentions, some of them are humanitarian developmentalists, but others are completely not. And everyone understands that it's just the reality that we have been facing since the Marshall Plan. Also, like, again, developing on the argument that you provided, you were very skeptical about Trump and said that probably after Trump the United States will get back to its core values. And my question is, what its core values in terms of development aid? It's tied aid, the largest part in the world, which it was really promoting that we're gonna do tied aid and how to say, just do not disturb us. We are giving the same amount. Another thing is that they always promoted security, national security, and they will keep doing it after Trump leaves. What is core values of the United States? The least generous donor, the most politicized donor. I do not see Trump's being such a negative person in this respect in terms of development. He talks a lot about it, but the United States in general very egoistic donor. He's very egoistic donor. And I think that one thing is to be passionate about being developmentalist, and I consider myself developmentalist, but your call for Russia, if Russia is to become the bigger donor, is also, my call is that it has to be a very realistic community of developmentalists that actually understand what is going on in the world through realist terms. It would be better for developmentalism in general if a good degree of, a good extent of criticism would be put into your rosy picture that you provided for us today. So this is my...
Well, don't leave. You see, this is kind of the area of development cooperation is like a melting pot. Because here we have a crossing of economic development issues, we have a crossing of social issues, and unfortunately, which Volodya put so openly and bluntly, is also a crossing of political and geopolitical dimensions and issues. And I don't know what Peter's response would be to this, because we do have only a few minutes left. But my response to this is that yes, this is also an unfortunately area of geopolitical tension and debate, which results eventually in the fact that the poorest of the poor don't get what they deserve to receive as human beings. And we in academia, and as I believe in my course I try to communicate, we need to put that on the agenda. Being realistic, understanding that political dimensions sometimes undermine the development needs, but in the final analysis, many of these things are coming back and hopefully will come back. Yeah. So, yes, realism, but we need to stay and continue some idealism. I agree. Peter, okay.
Well, yes. When Andre mentioned one of my jobs was I was head of the operations policy at the World Bank for a few years, 4 years, a bit less than 4 years. When I was interviewed for that job, I was asked, what is your management style? It's a very interesting question. What's your management style? And my answer was, I am relentlessly optimistic. So I am relentlessly optimistic, despite many years of working at the front line of development and all. So many people get cynical by that. I was always determined not to. That said, where I 100% agree with Vladimir. Two major dangerous trends have been going on. One is the return of the politicization of aid. I can't agree more than that. I wouldn't even count most of this money as being aid money. It's in the numbers, but you know it's not for me most of it. And the terrible political games that are being played in places like Yemen and indeed in Syria. This is not what. These are not. This got nothing to do with the core values of the government. I'm absolutely agree. That said, I have to end on a positive note. So I agree. It's very dangerous. And it's very dangerous because it might make everybody very cynical, and it might drive away those who wanted to advocate for more aid. If it's just going to go to, the wrong places, I'm not interested. As Andre has heard me speak elsewhere, I could not agree more. The United States is by far the worst donor, and you've heard me express some serious criticism of how they are by far the worst. And that's the fault of Congress, not the American people, because actually the American people are very generous as people. So I hope that when they come back, it's to the core values of the American people, not the core values of the aid administrators from the past. But the third thing that I would say, and it is not insignificant, it's not unimportant, yes, a lot of money went, a lot of the increase in aid has been politically driven in the last 20 years. But the increase in aid in development cooperation that was the response to the MDGs did go to Africa. And if you look at Africa, the change in welfare in Africa, the change in per capita income in Africa in the last 20 years compared to the first 40 years of the post-colonial era is dramatic. And aid has got something, it's better policies by the leaders of the country, but the increase in aid helped support that. So there is good news in the most developmentally challenged parts of the world. There's terrible news from the most politically challenging parts of the world, many of which are, and that's terrible.
Good. On this note, I suggest we conclude, and I thank Peter for coming to Russia, for spending his relaxed time in principle with the Russian officials here today and preparing. I thank once again Tigran for his support in organizing this trip. I want to thank Sofia Borisovna for giving the slot in the curriculum. And thank you for everybody for listening, and let's have a final talk. Thank you.